Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our webinar today, Protecting Your Business from a Destructive Cyber Attack with Isolated Recovery Solutions. My name is Lauren Simpson, and I'm with the Core Technologies marketing team. Today, we are going to make sure that this session is recorded, and it will be made available after the presentation. Alex, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide one, there we go. If you are having any problems with sound, you can try using headphones plugged into your device, or you can also dial in using the phone. Access code is on the screen. And what's really important to us is hearing from you. So you're welcome to use the Q&A chat throughout the session, and we'll try and address as many questions as we can throughout the presentation, and we'll also get to them at the end. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our presenter today, Mr. Alex Almeida.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate that. Good morning and good afternoon to all the folks listening here today. Welcome to our webcast here from Dell EMC. What I want to talk to you folks about today is really how important it is to keep in mind about all of the different cyber attacks and issues that may be affecting you folks out in the IT landscape today, particularly around enterprise and even mid-market. Really, in today's IT landscape, the threat model is really changing drastically. So you can see here, I talk about two different threats, the traditional threats. And really today, the theft of data in these traditional threats for the purposes of accessing personal customer information, while they still occur, they're no longer the main driving motivation of the bad actors, and they're turning to threats aimed at financial gain. Really, in addition to attacks aimed at holding data for ransom, attacks can also be founded in political activism with really the distinct purpose of data destruction to interrupt the business or actually destroy the business, right? So the key thing here is these bad actors are not going after personal information any longer. While those attacks still occur, the real driving threat is what we call more of these emerging threats. They're really there for cyber extortion or even cyber destruction. They don't really like the business they're attacking, or they don't believe in the business practices, and therefore will leverage bad threats towards that solution, that particular business. The solutions that are highlighted in this presentation will help you, the customer, increase the probability of recovering your most critical business data in light of these new emerging threat models that we are experiencing today. And that's the isolated recovery solutions. They are really designed to help you recover and give you additional protection to have a copy of data that is recoverable in the case of these emerging threats. Now, there have been numerous studies done assessing the current impact and regularity of these types of attacks and threats. In a specific report that I'm highlighting here that was done by Verizon, we've seen data corroborating a drastic increase in attack frequency, as well as a reduced time to intrusion and data compromise. So in about 60% of the cases, the bad actors can compromise an organization with malware within 6 minutes. However, on the other side of this, the ability for the organizations to detect these intrusions and this malware quickly is still under 25%. So the idea is that more and more attacks are coming quicker, and the bad actors are able to attack faster, but yet a lot of you out there in the IT industry still find that it's difficult to detect and often be able to eradicate this malware before it becomes an issue. Another key point is that a little over half of the attacks and the corresponding data compromised was based on ideologically based hacktivists. So this wasn't necessarily just financial gain. It was just as I mentioned on the slide before, these attacks or what was done and the type of data that was attacked is really targeted from a hacktivism standpoint. Due to the malicious intent of these attacks, protecting yourself from them is paramount. Being able to get the business back up and running as quickly as possible and recovering from the attack is really what we're talking about here. And failure to do so can really leave your business without its core systems and applications, which can impact revenue, business function, and really the hardest thing to win back customer trust and satisfaction. So we not only talk about impact to revenue, but in some cases in the industry, the potential for damage, financial damage to an institution could render the business bankrupt at that point based on the foregone revenue and the cost to recover operations. A lot of you may be familiar with some of these particular attacks. These are just a couple of examples. The Sony breach in particular in late 2014, November to be exact, was a watershed moment in the history of cyber attacks. There are a couple of points to be made about this specific attack that I want to talk about right now. First, it's believed that the attackers were inside of Sony's network for up to 6 months. Obviously, that's a long time, and it gave the attackers plenty of time to map the network and really identify the assets, find out their point of attack, and determine where the most critical data was stored. Before that attack began, the cyber criminals carefully exported loads of Sony data a little bit at a time. So they went after emails, personnel records, salary information, and 5 full movies, 4 of which were finished but not yet released. And then this data was then released on the internet, one piece at a time. So second, the attack unwound over a 48-hour period and really began by destroying Sony's recovery capability. Backup media targets and the associated master and media servers were destroyed first, and then that attack moved into their disaster recovery and production environments. After Sony recognized this attack and took measures to stop it, they went to their data protection infrastructure and then planned to restore damaged systems. Of course, that data protection infrastructure was destroyed. Along with it was their ability to recover. This put Sony down hard for 28 days, and they never really recovered much of their data. They were actually reduced, as you see on the quote here, reduced to writing paper checks, sending faxes. All of their IT infrastructure that they had relied on for business operations had been compromised, and they were reduced to very, very slow processing of their daily business. Now, one thing to keep in mind with Sony is that this is really the first sort of large public hacktivism type case that we've heard of, and the impact of it was interesting in that should a copy of that data have been isolated, there would have been increased probability that that data would have been able to be recovered into an isolated production environment, or at least allowed Sony to get an attack plan in place to recover from that intrusion. The other key thing here was that a lot of this wasn't just infrastructure. It was the lack of process and runbook procedures around what to do in the event of an attack like this. So a big component of what we talk about at Dell EMC is not that it's just the infrastructure. There are also very many professional services that we'll talk about that will help you and partner with you to design procedures and runbooks so that you can have a full-on procedure tied with the infrastructure to make sure that you are that much more efficient at recovering from an attack like this. Now, the other key thing is that the other scenario we have here on the slide, Hollywood Presbyterian. In this case, their data was encrypted and held at ransom. At this point, the CEO, in a letter from that institution, basically determined that the quickest way was to pay the ransom for that decryption key. And in the best interest of restoring the operations, they did this. Now, you may say, okay, great. Rather than spending all of this money on infrastructure, I'm just going to pay the ransom. Well, in another case, the ransom was paid, and the bad actors, seeing that the ransom was easily paid, essentially returned only half of the data encryption keys back. decryption keys rather, and then proceeded to ask for more money. So there's really no end to what these bad actors can do, and simply looking and considering paying the ransom is not necessarily a guaranteed recovery procedure and could end up costing the business more in the end. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, given the wave of some of these attacks, the leading U.S. government departments, such as the National Security Agency, the Federal Reserve Bank, and its audit branch, the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, as well as the SEC, have begun to issue guidance to really help businesses in what they should do when these kinds of attacks occur, and also what they should do to prevent those attacks. This guidance is also really being issued by non-U.S. organizations, even the European Banking Authority, and even non-financial industry organizations, like, for example, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. Everybody is talking about this, and much of the guidance that they are issuing has been done since the summer of 2015, after a lot of the postmortems around the high-profile attacks, such as Sony that we talked about before, occurred. Each of these organizations are emphasizing in their guidance the best practices like physical and logical network segregation, systems architectures that include air gaps, and testing to be sure that these efforts are effective. And we at Dell EMC intend to help you, the customers, do just that. So how do we help you do that? How do you go about protecting your business? Do you have confidence that the solutions you have in place now will be successful in preventing your business from grinding to a halt? The increasing use of sophisticated destructive attacks that I've explained is stressing current data protection strategies. No longer are they always effective in leaving your valuable company data open to cyber attacks is really a daunting proposition. So you can't just think of, well, I do my day-to-day nightly backups, therefore I'm protected. These attacks are getting more sophisticated. As you saw in the Sony attack, they actually went after the DR and the backups first, and then went after the production. So really, a single backup and recovery strategy, considering that you may already have one in place, may not be the only layer that is required to fully protect. So you can take immediate action to improve your cybersecurity status with what you have for data protection. So we at Dell EMC do approach this as a layer cake scenario. So really, it's making sure that, first off, I'm implementing my traditional data protection best practices. I'm deploying a layered data protection strategy that includes business continuance, includes my disaster recovery for shorter-term RPOs, and then also includes my backup and recovery for long-term retention and compliance, as long as business requirements for data retention. So making sure you have that N+1 is really the first deployment, and this not only for cybersecurity but also operational recovery of the business or natural disasters. And then on top of that, the second layer, if we dig a little bit down, it's additional hardening around the actual products and the infrastructure that you have in place. So for example, at Dell EMC, we all have security hardening guides for our products, such as Dell EMC Data Domain, and the ability to also provide you documentation on how to configure data encryption and enable things like immutable access for critical data on our system. So this is really the second approach. How do I take my infrastructure that's there already and make sure that from a security standpoint, I have hardened that infrastructure to make it harder for a bad actor to gain access to the administrative interface of that system or its data in the case of encryption. Now, what we'll concentrate in this webcast is really the third layer in this. The core of this is that we're looking at additional security infrastructure designs such as isolated recovery solutions, and then Dell EMC, together with our partners Ernst & Young, as well as other members of the Dell Technologies Group, such as RSA, to really provide fully rounded service offerings that can help you assess, plan and implement and even test in the event of an attack what would occur from a recovery standpoint for your environment. And now the fact that the threat model constantly changes and is evolving is important because we also need to evolve our professional services portfolio as well as our products to keep up with the evolving security threats. So it's really incorporating the use of these evolving security analytics tools and prevention tools that we at Dell EMC or others in the IT industry release. So together with our partners, it's really about advanced protection services that fully give you that additional layer of protection. So what exactly is the isolated recovery solution? Well, it's really a framework for ensuring your most precious business data is protected within your data center. So in addition to your primary, secondary, and sometimes tertiary data locations, you want to leverage an air-gapped isolated recovery environment. And that's really the key to this solution. So in this high-level diagram, you can see how the isolated recovery environment is connected to your production environment. And that's over a dedicated connection that has an air gap. And we'll talk a little bit about what air gap is. The air gapping can be a physical disconnection of the cable, or it can be a logical network layer port disconnect, port enable, port disable type workflow that during certain times or idle times keeps that connection to the isolated environment disconnected. So whether this is programmatic or the physical runbook of somebody going into that data center and physically pulling a Cat5 cable out of the isolated system, that is what we mean by air gap. So this is going to be based on the requirements that you have as a business and how much protection you would like to implement in this solution. Now, depending on the RPO objectives, the air gap is occasionally closed so that data can be sent to the isolated recovery environment. We have to get data into that isolated environment somehow. And then we immediately reinstate the air gap. So should your environment become compromised, as could be the case of a destructive cyber attack, you would be able to restore from the air-gapped environment. So that's really the key and the high-level requirement around this. Now, isolated recovery solutions, there are a couple of key components or a few key components to the solution. The first of all is planning and design. The key thing here is selection of business critical systems, applications, current infrastructure, what the recovery time needs are, what the RPOs are, and any other considerations. This really will determine what the right solution options are. Once you determine what business data you can't live without in the case of a cyber attack, and then how well you want to protect or how many copies you want to protect, and then how stringent you want to enforce the air-gapped connection, that is going to come out of the requirements from this planning and design exercise, identifying those systems and developing a strategy with objectives. Then it becomes about isolation and replication. So it becomes, once you determine what data it is, how do you want to implement that network isolation? Do you absolutely need an air gap? Is it a dedicated network link? And then implementing the automation and the scripting around actually implementing this isolated system. The other key component is validation of the data. So a couple of things here. This is something where you can choose as a customer to implement your own validation tools as you see fit to validate against malware or other types of bad acting code. Or you can look to Dell EMC Professional Services to be able to work with you on a proper validation technique and tool set to implement in this. So the key thing here is validating the copy of the data after it arrives inside of the isolated environment, and then storing those trusted copies with versioning inside of that isolated storage bucket. This is something that, again, as I mentioned, professional services, together with RSA and other members of the Dell Technologies group, and Dell EMC infrastructure and software should be able to be implemented here and leveraged to really provide a robust strategy, however you see fit as a customer, for validation of the data. But really what this solution is about, and really what we're here from an infrastructure standpoint, is really providing that ability to restore and recover. So what I'd like to say here is that even though malware may eventually make its way dormant inside of the isolated system, we have elements of the products, for example, EMC data domain, Dell EMC data domain, that will allow the malware to stay dormant and then allow you to eradicate that malware through the use of other third-party validation tools or malware eradication tools before the data is actually recovered back into a compute environment. Again, malware needs compute in order to execute and do its job. If we can store that data in a dormant way, and if it so happened to pass validation, there is still the possibility that that data could be recovered after the use of third-party malware extraction tools and other data validation and cleansing techniques. So really what the restore and recover about is making sure that the infrastructure is there, making the dynamic procedures to recover the destroyed data, and leveraging the investment in your DR application recovery procedures to assure that you can restore and recover your data. So you may think we're talking about traditional business continuity and DR, but really this concept of isolated recovery is more than that. And I'd like to talk about some of the concepts that make an IR solution really an IR solution. The first is isolation. An isolated environment, aka an IR vault or an isolated recovery zone that is disconnected from the network and restricted from users other than those with proper clearance. Some customers that we have implemented this solution in have physically locked this infrastructure in a cage in the main data center and only provided access to that equipment to select members of the IT team with the proper security clearance. Others treat these isolated environments as dark sites where the only status is a screen that is outside of that caged area that tells the status of the equipment inside of that caged area. So really this is making sure that isolation is implemented however you see fit to meet your security requirements. The other thing is the data copy and the scheduled air gap. Software to perform data copies to secondary storage and backup targets, as well as the procedures to schedule those copies over air gap network links between the production environment and this isolated area. Two types of data really should be stored in the IR vault. One of those is point-in-time copies, automatically copied into the IR vault on a scheduled basis, and master known good copies of desktop images, VMDK boot images, and server OS images. So we're really talking about once a template is created for a production system, it could be leveraged and copied into this isolated environment for assurance that those templates will not be compromised during an attack as well. Another key point of this is integrity checking and alerting, workflows to stage copy data in the isolated recovery zone and perform periodic integrity checks to rule out that it was affected by malware, along with mechanisms to trigger alerts in the event of a breach. So this is where the third-party software comes in, use of Dell EMC professional services. That's really where the integrity checking comes in. And there are things like Sentinel records, being able to break open backup save sets with, for example, one of our partners, Index Engines. That type of tool, together with our Dell EMC professional services, is what we are referring to here. The other key thing is recovery and remediation, procedures to perform the recovery after an incident. So this goes back to the Sony attack. Part of it was not necessarily just the infrastructure, it was also the fact that there was a lack of procedure and what the protocol would be in the event that a recovery would need to occur. So it's having master known good copies of OS images, having runbook procedures, and having people and process already coordinated and ready to go in the event of such an incident. So let me show you how a couple of our customers are leveraging isolated recovery to protect themselves from cyber attacks today. Here's an example of how a data domain based solution would work. Basically, it works on the fact that leveraging data domain that allows you to cover business critical systems on Dell EMC and non-Dell EMC storage from the protected backup data set. Like with any other Dell EMC product, proper security hygiene must be applied, such as turning off all non-essential ports, leveraging certificates for the connection, and in this case, traffic sent over the link can and should be encrypted. In this example, production backup data is stored on data domain protection storage within the production environment. Periodically, that air gap is closed and the mission critical data is replicated to the isolated system. At the completion of this copy operation, that air gap is reinstated. Once data in the isolated recovery environment, it can be analyzed and checked for sign of tampering, all based on runbook procedures and any solutions worked out either by you, the customer, or Dell EMC Professional Services. If the copy data is deemed to be good, it is then saved as an independent full backup copy, which can be restored from if needed. Should this data need to be restored, the air gap is again closed and data can be sent out of the isolated environment and back to production, or it can be sent to designated restore hosts that are not back in the production system, but are also resident in the isolated system. And this is a choice that some customers that we have implemented the solution at have made in order to prevent a subsequent attack or reinfection of the data. There are several best practices for the isolated recovery environment. First is having a dedicated restore and validation host within that recovery environment. So any sort of validation routines, automated tools that you want to use, that validation host should be tied and put in that isolated environment as well, not sharing that equipment between the production environment and the isolated environment. This further compromises things. Furthermore, the network should be hardened based on best practices, again, disabling all the necessary TCP/IP ports and services such as non-essential services such as Telnet, HTTP, FTP, etc. And then, of course, disabling all NIC interfaces not in use for the replication purpose itself. These are simple security hardening components of the solution that we can do today through our product security hardening guides. And the last best practice that I'll touch on is enabling data domain retention lock. So this is a functionality that ensures that data is written in warm fashion. So you can enable this on the isolated environment, and it will prevent data corruption or malicious data changes to a file system on the isolated recovery system. So should the environment become compromised, that bad actor will at least not be able to tamper with your mission critical backup data that is already on that device. So that is a key component. Once a file or backup save set is written to that isolated system, it can be locked with worm technology and prevented from further tampering. Here's really an example of how VMAX 3 based isolated recovery was leveraged by a large company in the financial services industry. Their challenges were they needed to recover from cyber destruction. They needed to keep the lights on, and that were associated with their mainframe environment. We've actually seen quite a few mainframe scenarios from this particular solution, and since the key requirement was short recovery time and minimal data loss, the VMAX replication-based solution was really ideal. The customer wanted to store frequent restore points of local replicas, plus ZDP provided a perfect solution. This solution was not air gapped, so you can see this is really not a requirement in order to be fully protected. So let's take a look at a little bit more detail. So similar to the data domain example, A primary storage system can replicate its data over an air-gapped link to an isolated recovery environment. Again, periodically, we open and close the air gap and replicate that data to the isolated system. At the completion of this copy, the air gap is reinstated, and then the data can be analyzed and checked. The other key thing is, from a best practice, and the difference here is that with the SRDF capability, I can implement this SRDF-based replication over fiber channel, therefore further isolating that system off of any sort of TCP/IP network. And more importantly, I can orchestrate the recovery or the replication of the data from my production into the isolated environment from within the isolated environment. So I can have a management host that literally kicks off the SRDFA replication from the production into the isolated by simply talking to the isolated VMAX. So this is a key feature as part of the VMAX architecture that assists in further isolating the VMAX. But again, similar network hardening procedures are also best practices. And then, of course, the automated runbook is key as well. So again, a similar architecture to the data domain side with the possibility of fiber channel being implemented here for further network isolation. So now that the basics of what compromises and isolated recovery solutions have been covered here, let's discuss the next steps and considerations. So it's never too soon to start planning for the inevitable. And there are many different considerations to account for here, and some to get you thinking about how an isolated recovery solution could be implemented. The first thing to think about is, what would you protect? What do you value most in your line of business? What data is most critical to recovering your business should you need it? Next up is the procedures and relating to how you approach cybersecurity. What tools and processes do you use and follow to both detect and recover your mission-critical data? The metrics in this context are the isolated recovery metrics, isolated recovery time objectives, isolated recovery point objectives, similar terms to regular backup and recovery and BCDR discussions, but really we need to talk about them in the context of specifics to isolation. The number of generations kept, how many copies of this data, how frequent am I going to do this data into my isolated recovery vault? The key thing is the other metrics that we need to talk about are things like destruction detection objective. How long do you have a requirement, or does it take your business to determine that a destruction event has occurred and that data needs to be recovered? So we use these metrics to design and size the technology in the isolated vault, and also to set expectations for the solution. So as for binaries, copies of transaction and other dynamic data are typically made at least once a day. A daily copy cycle would provide the equivalent of a 24-hour typical disaster recovery point. Whereas changes to executable binaries typically happen on a more periodic basis, every other week. For example, if you subscribe to Microsoft's patching notification methodology, or in the case of AppLibs, when a new release is moved into production, consider also that zero-day malware can lie dormant for months. So if you had a separate on-demand protection copy cycle for binaries, you can go back further in time, and each checkpoint copy could be used as a potential recovery source. And then there's cleanse and restore, or really flatten and recover. So when it comes to recovering from an attack, do you need to attempt to clean the affected production systems and restore data from the isolated recovery vault? Or do you really opt to re-image the production environment entirely with a known good binary and then restore the data? Your isolated recovery time and isolated recovery point, as well as the number of copies you're storing in the vault, will affect the type of recovery you choose to perform. If you think you'd benefit from isolated recovery solutions, then the Dell EMC Intro Advisory Service for isolated recovery as part of our professional services portfolio is a great way to begin and work towards reducing the odds that your business will be brought down due to a cyber attack. The following steps are not really meant to be exclusive, but you should provide a good framework to get started. So our advisory services will do things like analyzing the program's maturity, helping customers set isolated recovery metrics, and evaluating alternatives. And then for the isolated recovery solution, it's this sort of service we envision would help in identifying the design consideration. Things like, what do I protect, what metrics, and so on and so forth. We'd work with you as a partner to develop a realistic architecture, a high-level design, and identify any technology requirements. We can follow with or lead design and implementation services, then put that advice into action. We plan the implementation, actually install it, test the solution, and demonstrate its capability, all as part of our professional services catalog. This is a proven methodology that we have had in place for some time, and we're confident these kinds of services, the advisory, the design, and implementation, can help put and address the worries around this need. So this is a key wrap-up to the solution. The key thing here is we have both the infrastructure that has design elements that differentiate that infrastructure in the industry for this specific use case, and then also we have a very robust professional services catalog that allows you to choose how much you want to partner with Dell EMC around implementing a solution like this. So it can be simple as, I'd like the additional infrastructure and I'm going to take care of the implementation, the runbook design, and all of that from you, the customer standpoint. Or it could be, I really want Dell EMC to sit down as a partner, go through, make sure I understand what data I need to protect, what the business impact is going to be, and then follow through all the way through an implementation and test scenario. So you can see here very robust services and capabilities, as well as the differentiating infrastructure. So with that, I will turn it back to Lauren, and then we'll close it out, and then we'll get to your questions and close out this webcast.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alex. So anybody, if you do have questions, go ahead and enter those in the chat now in that Q&A area. And also feel free to get social with us. We've got a bunch of different ways that you can connect with us and keep up to speed on all the different activities that we have going on. So first is with Twitter. So you can see the Twitter handles there at Dell EMC Protect, at Dell EMC Storage, and at Dell EMC Extreme IO. You can also follow us on our page on Facebook. And then also it's great to subscribe to the core blog. And that is still at our emc.com page. So it's thecoreblog.emc.com. So let's see here. Do we have any questions in the chat? I don't see any yet. Also, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. This recording will be made accessible on our Bright Talk channel and also on our website. The Bright Talk channel is another great way where you can register for upcoming webinars. So that is brighttalk.com/channel/13935. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. And it looks like we can, here we go. Well, you're welcome for the presentation today. Good job, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. We appreciate you joining the webcast today. And if anybody else has any questions, please reach out to your field teams. We have done a lot of work around making sure that they are well-versed and understand the points of this solution. And ultimately, they know where to find us. So please don't hesitate to reach out to your account teams if you are interested in this Dell EMC solution. So with that, Lauren, I think we can close it out.
Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful day or afternoon, and we'll talk with you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.